FBI agent pulled over and humiliated by police for his dreadlocks. What happens next is shocking. Mark Ben was a man who stood out. His commanding presence, tall frame, and meticulously kept dreadlocks made him instantly noticeable. But what truly set him apart was his unwavering dedication to justice as one of the few black agents working for the FBI's International Division, stationed in the UK. Years of covert operations and deep undercover work had taught him to remain calm under pressure. Little did he know that his greatest test would come on an ordinary day, in an ordinary way. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. Mark had just wrapped up a meeting with Scotland Yard, a routine debriefing on a joint operation between the UK and the US. He was driving back through the quiet streets of a suburban London borough when flashing blue lights caught his attention. Mark pulled over, glancing into his rearview mirror, watching a white female officer exit her vehicle. She approached with rigid steps, the cold October air swirling around her. Her name tag read Stella Anderson. The officer's eyes flicked to his dreadlocks as she got closer, and her expression hardened. "License and registration, please," she demanded curtly. Mark, cool and collected, handed over his credentials. "I'm Agent Mark Ben with the FBI." Her eyes narrowed, barely glancing at the badge. "And what does an *FBI agent * need dreadlocks for? You think that makes you look more intimidating?" Her voice was laced with disdain, but Mark had encountered prejudice before. He stayed silent, letting her words roll off him like water. "What's the issue, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "You're the issue," she snapped, stepping back and looking over the car suspiciously. "Driving a car like this? Dressed like that? Doesn't look right. Are you really an agent? Or just trying to pass for one?" She circled his car, her eyes never leaving his. Mark felt her gaze bore into him like he was a suspect, not a man who had risked his life to uphold the very law she was sworn to protect. Mark could feel his patience wearing thin. He had endured profiling before, but this time was different. He wasn't a stranger on the street. He was a federal agent. This wasn't supposed to happen. But it did, and not just because of his dreadlocks or the car he drove, but because of his skin color. When she returned, her face was harder than before. "Step out of the car!" Mark hesitated, stunned by the escalation. "I've shown you my credentials. What exactly are you accusing me of?" "Step out," she repeated, her hand resting on her holster. Mark knew that look. It was the kind of silent threat black men like him had faced for centuries. Reluctantly, Mark got out, his tall frame towering over the officer, though he kept his movements slow, careful not to make any sudden gestures. A crowd was starting to gather, watching from a distance. The situation felt absurd. Here he was, an FBI agent being treated like a criminal because of his appearance. The humiliation was palpable. Stella Anderson made no attempt to hide her disdain, going so far as to mock his dreadlocks. "A bit unprofessional for a so-called agent, don't you think? Or is this part of some undercover act?" Mark took a deep breath. He knew what was happening, but he needed to keep calm. "Is there a legitimate reason for the stop, or are you harassing me based on how I look?" "Watch your tone," Stella shot back. "I've got probable cause. Your kind doesn't belong driving this type of car in this area." The words stung more than he expected. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was about stripping away his dignity. But Mark had something Stella didn't know. His vehicle had dash cams, recording everything. What was about to unfold would soon be more than just his word against hers. Things escalated when she radioed for backup, claiming she had a suspicious individual. The situation could have spiraled out of control had Mark not stayed composed. His hands remained visible, his voice steady. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly, locking eyes with her. "You've already crossed a line." The backup arrived, a senior officer, Sergeant McAllister. He approached cautiously, reading the tense atmosphere. When Mark saw McAllister, he knew there was a chance to right this. "Sergeant," Mark called out, "you know me. We've worked together on joint ops." The sergeant hesitated, recognizing Mark almost immediately. His eyes shifted to Officer Anderson, clearly puzzled. "What's going on here?" Stella Anderson stiffened but didn't back down. "I pulled him over. He was acting suspicious. Claims he's FBI, but something's off. His behavior, the way he looks." McAllister's gaze flicked between the two of them. "Stella, he's FBI. I can vouch for him. You've made a mistake." The shock on Stella's face was clear, but what followed next was the most unexpected twist of all. The crowd that had gathered was recording everything, and Mark's dashcam footage had already transmitted to his FBI colleagues. Within hours, the entire department was alerted to the incident, triggering an internal investigation. Stella Anderson was forced to answer for her actions in front of the police board. What she claimed was a routine stop became a case study in racial profiling, systemic bias, and the abuse of power. The footage was undeniable: her words, her demeanor, and her unfounded suspicion. The media picked up the story, turning it into a national conversation about racism within law enforcement, especially in the UK, where people often believed such issues were more prevalent across the Atlantic. Protests and public debates erupted, challenging not just Stella's actions, but the broader culture within the force. For Mark Ben, justice came swiftly. Not only was Stella suspended, but she became the symbol of everything wrong with racial profiling. As for Mark, his composure and professionalism throughout the ordeal were widely praised. He became an advocate for policing reform, using his experience to shed light on the challenges black men faced, even those in positions of authority. What was meant to be a simple drive home turned into a powerful reminder of the deep-rooted biases that persist, even against those sworn to uphold the law. And in the end, Mark's dignity remained intact, his courage in the face of humiliation sparking a wave of change that reached far beyond that suburban London street. What happened next was shocking, but perhaps not in the way anyone expected. A single act of humiliation led to the unraveling of a much larger system, one that now had to face the consequences of its own prejudices. Stella Anderson sat in the tribunal hearing room, a cold bead of sweat tracing down the back of her neck. The room was filled with colleagues, investigators, and legal experts, all reviewing the footage that had circulated online, footage she never thought would leave that quiet street. As the grainy dashcam recording played, every word she had spoken echoed in the silent room. Her disdain, the thinly veiled insults about Mark's dreadlocks, and her racially charged assumptions rang louder than any defense she could muster. There was no escape from the reality that her actions were on full display, not just for her department, but for the world. Across the room sat Mark Ben, dressed in his formal suit, dreadlocks tied back neatly. He hadn't wanted to be here. He hadn't wanted any of this. But now, sitting in the audience of his own story, he realized how much larger this moment was. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who didn't have the badge, the dashcam, or the credibility to challenge officers like Anderson. The panel of judges deliberated, their expressions grim as they weighed the evidence. After what felt like an eternity, the head of the tribunal cleared his throat and looked directly at Stella. "Officer Anderson, the evidence presented before this board clearly shows a violation of duty, unprofessional conduct, and racially motivated bias. You have been found guilty of misconduct. Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position in the police force." The gavel struck down, finalizing the verdict. Stella's face drained of color. Her career, once built on power and control, had crumbled in a single moment of unchecked prejudice. She stood, numb and in shock, her mind racing to grasp the reality of what had just happened. Mark remained seated, watching silently as Stella was escorted out. He felt no joy in seeing her fall, no satisfaction in her punishment. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. As she left the room, he felt the weight of the eyes on him, people waiting to see his reaction, expecting anger or triumph. But instead, Mark stood up, calm and composed, and left without a word. In the months that followed, Mark became a leading voice in the movement for police reform. His story wasn't just a viral sensation anymore, it was a catalyst for change. Laws were re-examined, policies adjusted, and training programs rewritten. Mark used his platform to push for deeper awareness of the systemic biases that had allowed officers like Stella to operate unchecked for so long. Meanwhile, Stella Anderson faded from the public eye, her story becoming a cautionary tale for law enforcement officers everywhere. She had once wielded her badge like a weapon, but now she had to face the consequences of her actions without the shield of authority to protect her. As for Mark, he continued his work with the FBI, but his mission had expanded. He wasn't just fighting crime, he was fighting for equality, for justice, and for a future where men like him wouldn't have to defend themselves against the very system they served. And so, what had started as a simple traffic stop became the beginning of something far greater. The shock wasn't in what had happened to Mark that day, it was in how one act of humiliation could unravel a system and ignite a wave of transformation that no one had seen coming. Mark Ben didn't set out to be a hero, but in standing his ground, in refusing to be silenced, he became one. And the world, ever watching, was forever changed. Leave a comment if you enjoyed this story. It doesn't cost you anything, and you'll make me very happy. Thank you, and I look forward to your like.